to introduce Mr. Greg Mortenson. Mr. Mortenson is an author and founder of the nonprofit Central Asia Institute. He's a co-author of New York Times bestseller, 3 Cups of Tea. He was a U.S. Army medic in Germany during the Cold War, graduate of the University of South Dakota, pursued graduate studies in neurophysiology. He's got a lifelong interest in adventure and mountaineering, culminating in climbing K2 in 1993. Since 1993, he's dedicated his life as a humanitarian devoted to promote education, especially for girls in remote regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan. He's established over 58 schools there, providing education for over 24,000 children. A living hero to rural communities who has gained trust by Islamic leaders, military commanders, and tribal chiefs for his efforts in championing education. He's traveled to more than 60 countries in his lifetime and is routinely sought after for his cross-cultural experience. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Greg Mortenson.
Thank you, Admiral Weisskopf, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and officers, and members of the community, and people from many different countries. I'd also like to greet Admiral Roughhead, the Chief of Naval Operations. I haven't met you yet. Are you right there? Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you, sir. We haven't had 3 cups of tea yet, but we're already part of the family, right? And also, John Jackson, who's worked very hard to, he invited me here several months ago, and I'm very honored to be here, and I look forward to developing a long-term relationship with that. I also want to let you know, I'm a veteran, and all my talks, I go quite significantly to military bases and talk with special forces troops and the military, Army, Navy. We're going to Afghanistan. I do this all on a voluntary basis as a way to give back to my country. So I got an honorarium to here, and I'm going to donate it to the Naval Foundation. It's the right name, John? And it's easy for me to ask for other people to give money, so I'd like you to support the Naval, the War College. And I was at West Point, and this is recently, and I thought, it was run by the government, but they told me that 3/4 of the money they have to raise privately, and so I'm going to go around and raise. Now we have to have bake sales to help the military also. Well, so first of all, I'd like to greet you in the appropriate way from Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be with you. I was very getting the AV set up here, so I'll keep talking a little bit. I was very blessed to grow up in Africa for 15 years. I went over there in 1958 when I was 3 months old. My father ended up building a hospital on the slopes of Kilimanjaro. My father worked very hard to get the hospital set up, but one thing he always insisted on was having local people in charge. That often got him in trouble with the Americans and Europeans, because they said, you need a qualified, trained expat to run the show. But my father stuck with his guns, or he stuck with his tenet that local people can be in charge. And finally, the hospital opened up in 1972, and my father got up and gave a speech. And he said just one simple thing, that I have a prediction to make that in 10 years, all the department heads of this hospital will be from your country, from Tanzania. And afterwards, he got into some trouble. Some people said, how can you dare say such a thing and set these people up for such an unrealistic expectation? Well, we came back to the States, and my father died in his late 40s from cancer. But we got the annual report 10 years later from the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center, and all the department heads were from Tanzania. And even today, 38 years later, all the department heads of the hospital there are from Tanzania. And I think it's an important lesson that wherever we go in the world, that we're there to serve the good people of those countries, not only to serve the American public and our people's interests, but also the good people of Afghanistan or Africa or in any country, and that people can be empowered. And I was a little nervous. 3 Cups of Tea in the book, I was at the Pentagon right after 9/11 a couple times, and I mentioned that I saw a lot of what I call laptop warriors. And so when General Petraeus and Admiral Mike Mullen first contacted me about a year and a half ago and they wanted to meet me and talk to me, I was a little nervous because I had made some comments like that in the book. But after I met them, they said, you know, that was actually a fair assessment of the military at the time. But the thing that is not in 3 Cups of Tea is what I've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. There's been a tremendous learning curve in the military. We have incredible military leaders nowadays, and I take great pride in saying that I think the military is ahead of the State Department and our political leaders in building relationships, because many of our commanders have been in Afghanistan or Iraq 3 or 4 times, and they really get it, that if we really want to succeed in those countries, we have to empower the elders, build relationships. And even General Petraeus, who read 3 Cups of Tea last year, he sent me an email, and being a military general, you know, he summarized what he had learned from the book in 3 bullet points. So he sent me this very short email, but it said, here's what I have gleaned from your book. Do you think this is a fair assertion? He said, number 1, we need to listen more. Number 2, we need to build relationships. And number 3, we have to have respect, meaning that we are to not only respect our country, but the good people of Afghanistan. I couldn't say it in any better way than General Petraeus. Admiral Mike Mullen also read 3 Cups of Tea. The one thing, though, that I have to tell you is that all these generals and admirals who read the book, they never told me that it was their wives who read it first and said, hey, honey, you ought to check this book out. You know, on the front cover, there's a bunch of little girls. And I learned that when I spoke with about 20 military commanders' wives, and they said, you know, we were the ones who actually first read the book. So I said, thank you. Are we ready with the AB yet? Okay. When you get done, just let me know. I think I'll go a little bit. I'm going to start today. I'm do a little bit different talk than I usually do, but I'm going to talk a little bit about counterinsurgency and the coin, and why I think I've seen really incredible things happening. And I know there's some controversy over coin and counterinsurgency, but if you start going district by district, and that's the level I work at. I work at the micro level. You know, I'm unfortunately wasn't here for the global and the strategic, you know, regional and level, but I do know at the micro level, district level, incredible things are happening. In Afghanistan, this one example, in 2000, there were 800,000 kids in school. Today, 9 years later, there are 8.4 million children in school in Afghanistan, including 2.6 million girls. It is the greatest increase in school enrollment in any country in modern history. And without embarrassing you, I want to ask you here, I've talked to over 400,000 people in last year. I've asked people, how many of you are aware of that fact? Only about 50 people have put their hands up. This includes, I was on Capitol Hill briefing 5 U.S. senators last month, and after I told them that, they were patting themselves on the back, and I said, how can you take credit for something you don't even know about? You know, that's a politician for you. I know in the military we don't like to talk about politics very much, but I thought but the real reason they're there, and certainly we can take some credit, the real reason though is there's a fierce desire for education. People, they want education, and I think education is the key to hope and peace. General Petraeus read, he was interviewed at the Berlin Strategic Summit every year. I think it happens in February in Berlin. And there was a very serious military correspondent interviewing him. And I know sometimes it's very difficult to be interviewed by the media. And so they asked General Petraeus, what should be our top priority in Afghanistan? Without hesitating a beat, he said, what we need to do is drink more tea and get to know the locals. Well, the correspondent was, a little befuddled, and this is on, you can get it on NPR, you can actually pull out this interview. And the correspondent again said, no, I'm serious, what should be our really top priority? And General Petraeus said, I already told you. I said, we need to go and build relationships. And with that, the interview was done. Admiral Mike Mullen, between Admiral Mike Mullen, Admiral Eric Olson, who's a SOCOM commander, General Petraeus, General McChrystal, our top 4 military commanders have been in Afghanistan and Pakistan over 32 times in the last year. I checked this just yesterday with the Pentagon. 32 times in 1 year. If you compare that with our State Department and our political leaders, it's tenfold of what they're doing. And Admiral Mullen was in Afghanistan about 3 weeks ago with some associates, and he was in Afghanistan 2 days and then Pakistan. And what he did for 12 hours a day is he summoned the tribal leaders, the militia leaders, the ulema, these are the religious leaders, the government, provincial leaders, and he sat and listened to them for about 12 hours, 2 days in a row. And many of them berated him. They said, you know, we're really upset, we're frustrated. And then he went over to Pakistan and did the same thing. And there was even some people from the tribal areas who really, you know, gave him a thorough, you know, you don't usually chew out the chief of staff and the joint chairman chief of staff, but they told him some things about what they felt. And, you know, that was the first time in history that the U.S. has sent somebody, and ironically it's a military commander, to go over and listen to the people for 2 days in both countries. President Karzai was very upset because Mullen only met him for 15 minutes. He said, you know, I'm the president, you're supposed to be talking to me. And Mullen said, I need to meet the people and listen to them. And that's where our policy is being formed now. And some of the military commanders here know now that there's kind of going to be like a 3-year deployment to Afghanistan, not meaning you're going to go there for 3 years, but your commitment is going to be to one area with your company or your regiment or your, what's in the Navy, is it called sorry. I'm an Army guy, but it's going to be building relationships and empowering the people. And I'm very excited. I'm very optimistic. And I think, you know, we can be despondent or we can look at the media and read about all these horrible things happening. But I'm very optimistic. And I think we need to exude that optimism to the American public, to the good people of Afghanistan, and also to our own, and the troops especially, that there is a reason and there is hope in Afghanistan. Thanks, sir. I thought, well, instead of putting this at the end of talk normally, and this, I limit this to military audience, some of this stuff. So, and since I'm a civilian, if some of this crosses into classified or non-classified, you know, you're going to have to run a stick up here. But I'm just going to talk to you a little about counterinsurgency. There's, I think, 2 different thoughts. Is one, when dealing with counterinsurgency, is that we have what we call conventional wisdom, or it's how we're kind of trained to thought, and then the reality on the ground is completely different. One is that we see the Taliban as somewhat of a military strategic entity, but really, in reality, Taliban is kind of a social entity. And the thing that we are not aware of is that the Taliban have really do not have the populace support. The Taliban basically, even more and more now, becoming more of a criminal element, and you know, you could say thugs, or they rule by extortion, by pressure, or intimidation, and very severe intimidation. And there's changing sentiment in Afghanistan and Pakistan. People are really sick and tired of having outsiders come in, you know, beat the women, behead school headmasters, extort, ask for supplies and you know, men to come and fight for them. And I think we need to latch on to that and really build relationships with the good people of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Also, in the military, I think sometimes we look at terms of what I call in the bottom enemy-centric. We look at, our main focus is on the enemy. But what's happening now on the ground in Afghanistan, very exciting with General McChrystal and some other commanders, is that they're looking at what I call the more relationship friend-centric. First, we build the relationships, and then we worry about the enemy. And because ultimately, the real enemy is ignorance, and it's ignorance that breeds hatred, and we need to completely shift that around. And so just thinking about the enemy, we've got to first think about our friends and building those relationships. And I think the key to everything, I think, is in respecting the elders and putting them back in charge. I started really thinking about this when I visit about 200 schools a year here in the U.S., from kindergartens all the way through the Air Force Academy, you know, private public schools and urban rural schools. And I ask students in every school, how many of you have talked in great detail to your grandparents about World War II or the Depression or the Vietnam War? Or some vets will say, what about the Korean War? Or maybe the civil rights movement. And unfortunately in the States, an average, you can do this in any of your schools, about 10% of the hands will come up, maybe 5 to 20%. But if I ask that same question in rural Afghanistan or Pakistan, 90 to 100% of the hands come up. And I think it's a great tragedy that we've lost that tradition where we can learn from our elders, not only about respect, but about our heritage, our folklore, our culture, or many of the mistakes or successes that we've had in history. In all our schools now in Afghanistan and Pakistan, one thing we do is we have the elders come in 2-3 times a week and do the storytelling so that children can learn about the heritage. What the Taliban are trying to do also is driving a wedge through society by destroying the relationship between the elders and the grandchildren, and they do that very deliberately. And I put together some help with some Marines from MARSOC. I was talking about this, and they had the maps and everything, so we've along with also Colonel Kalenda, who's in the military. He's a counterinsurgency instructor. So I put together this kind of schematics about what I kind of see happening on the ground and how by destroying that relationship you can really disrupt society and really can change the power base away from the elders and the respected tribal leaders. So this is traditional Afghan power structure, not this blank screen here, hang on here. Although the government right now is having a little trouble here, where you have these are what the enlightened mullahs. The M means a mullah, and the E is an elder, and the Y is a youth. And the M is a traditional imam, very devout imam, but who also teaches about the tenets of Islam and the Quran about service to humanity and respect and tolerance. And villages are self-governing. I think that's another thing that's important. And we're looking at Afghanistan as a centralized system. Afghanistan is a provincial and district system, multi-ethnic, multi-feudal society. And the strength and the resilience is with tribal or regional or provincial governance, not central governance like we have in the States. Although sometimes I'm from Montana, so we don't pay too much attention to D.C. I met a gentleman here from Montana. Where are you? Right back there. And then all these things happen over 30 years. The communists, the Soviets invaded, the warlord era. In the 90s, Hikmetyer and Massoud and Dostum, jihadism, failed the monarchy, the leaving of the king who went over to Rome for 60 years, and then finally in the mid-90s, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now we're going to just watch how very civil, loose governance and society, it'll get disrupted as the idealism comes in and the Taliban moving in, and there's funding for that, and the radical mullahs here now are coming in the Fs with the power base, and then they're going to start to pull the Y. These are the youth off of the elders and the mullahs, which is how 2,000-year-old tribal tradition works. This is the first time I've ever done this. So when I first came out with 3 cups of tea, I had my dad's 40-year-old slide projector with duct tape, and the publishers were horrified, and they said, "You've got to get this PowerPoint stuff." Still learning and working on it. You can see, though, how with the radicals and funding, then the youth start to be their heroes or role models are now the radical and extremist leaders and not the elders or the traditional mullahs, and how they're pulled off from the power base. And John, I'll give this to you afterwards and with some notes so you can discuss this in the classrooms. And then you have, it's kind of called the breakup or atomization of how these nuclear ethnic groups that were somewhat held together by tribal laws in Nanawati now are completely fractured and torn apart. And then they start getting recruits. There are also foreign fighters coming in, pulling them out of the making relationships. That's the Pakistan-Afghan border that just showed up here. And these networks, they're very loose, though. I always think, when you think of Al-Qaeda, I think you need to think in terms of not a structure or hierarchy, but a concept. And that's what the power in doing that. So in tribal society, we'll leave some notes here afterwards, but I think one thing is that they're community-based, not individual-based. You're only as strong as the weakest link in a community. Also, it's very dynamic, the relationships of war and people in poverty and what we consider the enemy. And in a tribal society, loyalty first is always to your family, to your tribe, and then perhaps whether you're Sunni or Shia, to your religious sect, your ethnic group, and then what I call maybe money, and then finally to country. Here in America, if you ask somebody, most people say I'm an American, and then I might say I'm a Norwegian Lutheran after that. But over there, first you're a Pathan, or you're from a clan, and then you're Sunni or Shia, and then finally your third loyalty will be to your country. And a person over there will die for family. Third cup of tea, your family, and for a family prepared to die, but they will not necessarily die for their country. That's not maybe an option, so we need to think of that in terms of their loyalty. Also, I think the main thing is that this is a very difficult, long, tedious, patient, but also beautiful process. We need to think about this in terms of if we want success or to leave, we need to think in terms of generations, not even decades, presidential fiscal cycle, or troop rotations. And I think, to me, that's very exciting now that I've spoken to some people on and the DOD, that we're getting into kind of this 3-year kind of policy. So 3 cups of tea. I first wrote the book and I picked the title, but the publisher picked the original subtitle, and they said it would be One Man's Mission to Fight Terrorism One School at a Time. And although I'm a military veteran, I was opposed to that because I said the real reason I do this is to promote peace. Well, they disagreed with me, so I went to Manhattan, and this is very frightening. I summoned a jirga, like a tribal conference, and CEO and head of marketing and head of publicity. And, I'm this little guy from Montana, what do I know? And I said, I want the subtitle to be about promoting peace, not about fighting terrorism. Well, they disagreed with me, and they said, Greg, this is your first book, so you need to sit down, son, and learn a few things about the publishing industry, because only 1 out of 8 nonfiction books makes a profit. And we'd like to support your book, but you need to be fighting terrorism so we can pitch the media, and then your book will do well. Well, finally I conceded, but if you work in Afghanistan or Pakistan or in Africa, or maybe here in Newport for a while, you learn that you never settle a deal without driving a hard bargain on the side. Maybe that's how you have to do it when you're dealing with Capitol Hill, too, here in the Navy for appropriations. So I said, if the hardcover doesn't do well, I want the paperback subtitle changed. So the hardcover came out March 2006. It didn't do very well for a year. And finally, a year later, they changed the subtitle to One Man's Mission to Promote Peace, One School at a Time. And now it's been a New York Times bestseller for 123 weeks in a row. And obviously, and of course, there are very compelling reasons of how terrorism can be fought with education. But I really think the ultimate enemy, whether it's here in the US or Afghanistan or Africa, it's ignorance. And ignorance that breeds hatred. And to overcome ignorance, we have to have education. We also have to build relationships. We also have to really empower people. And that's why I want to be here a little bit as a cheerleader for what the military is doing and taking very bold steps, very scary steps sometimes, and maybe risky steps. But I really think that things now, finally, starting about 2 or 3 years ago, really are heading in a much more productive direction. So as you know, here's your boss here. And he's a great guy. He's from LA, and we've also gotten to know each other. Now we've had 3 cups of tea together, so I consider Admiral Mike Mullen here now part of the family. And General Petraeus here, who's now with CENTCOM, here's his 3 bullet points that he sent me. Listen more, have respect, and build relationships. As I mentioned, I grew up in Africa. My father founded the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center in Tanzania. He spent a long time getting the hospital set up, and finally it was time to come back in 1972 to the States. And I was very excited because I wanted to have 4th of Julys and play football and fireworks and all those great things we celebrate. But my first day in high school in St. Paul, Minnesota, I got beat up. The kids, and it was because I made a mistake. I said, I'm African. There was a lot of confusion there. And it's okay to laugh, because it was the first time in my life they learned about the word racism. So I had a pretty hard time, and so we were very poor. I lived in Minnesota. So 4 days after high school, June of '75, I did something quite unpopular at the time. I joined the U.S. Army, and I did it to serve my country, just as all my forefathers had done. And I also did it to get the GI Bill so I could get an education, go on and get my university degree. It was actually in the Army where I met young men and women from all across the U.S., and it made me appreciate that we are a great country. But it's not because of our commonality, but because of our great diversity. And we can all be brought together, as children of our great country. In Africa, as a proverb, as a child I learned a proverb, and it says that if we educate a boy, we educate an individual, but if we educate a girl, we educate a community. Now, there's mostly men here, but I think it's really women who propagate the value of education in a community. And this is an important thing to remember in a country like Afghanistan or Pakistan. After 9/11, the Taliban had an actually high desertion rate. This is before the U.S. we went into Afghanistan. The Taliban were primarily going around getting recruits. They were targeting illiterate, impoverished society because many educated women refused to allow their son to join the Taliban. And in Islam, before someone goes on jihad, and jihad means a struggle or quest, they first should get permission from their mother. And if they don't, it's very shameful or disgraceful. When a woman has an education, she's much less likely to condone her son to get into violence or into terrorism. And I see that happen again and again, and that's a thing that why education can also be very powerful. 3 cups of tea started out with my youngest sister Krista, who died from severe epilepsy in '92. On the eve of the day she was going to go to the Field of Dreams in Dyersville, Iowa to see where the baseball movie was filmed. So in honor of my sister, I decided to take her amber necklace, she got into Africa, and go climb K2, the world's second highest mountain in the Karakoram range of northern Pakistan. And just to give you a size of this range, there are 64 peaks above 23,000 feet high in a 100-mile radius. That's, next time, what's the local highway going by Newport here? 138, okay. Is it pretty straight? Oh, okay. I always say, when you go down local freeway, clock yourself 5 miles and pretend you're going straight up. And then I was in Boston, they said, the roads here don't go straight, they go in circles. In Montana, we have very straight roads for 100 miles. So this is K2, the world's second highest mountain. The first attempt was by the Duke of Abruzzi, an Italian, who reached halfway up on the right-hand side. 1909, 100 years ago, he was wearing hobnail boots. Being a gentleman, he even wore a tweed jacket and a tie, eating cans of sardines. We didn't have a lot of money, so we did what we could. We have 2-season family camping tents, and in the right foreground, you can see a green tent. It's a French Legionnaires tent designed for the French Legionnaires who are deployed in the Algerian desert in the Sahara. And we had 12 climbers. The gentleman, I'm going to talk about cultural sensitivity. The gentleman in the middle, I won't tell you where he's from without the shirt, but he left after 1 week because he said there's no alcohol in Pakistan. That's a true story. And this is an avalanche. Just to give you a scale of this, if you look way down in the right foreground, you can see 4 little blue tents. And if you had a magnifying glass, you can see 4 Spanish men in their underwear running out of the tents. Fortunately, nobody was killed in this avalanche. So here we're going up the West Ridge. It's between straddles Pakistan and Afghanistan. And finally, 78 days later, I got within 500 meters of the summit, but I didn't quite make it to the top. My 2 partners did summit, and I actually decided not to summit so I could help my partners when they came down off the mountain. But coming off the mountain, I was very disappointed because I was very set on that goal. Kind of in Montana, it was like a